I want to begin by reminding you of something that often gets lost in loud political slogans and confident headlines. When a powerful country says we do not need anyone else, that statement is almost never about facts. It is about power, about posturing, and about a fantasy of self sufficiency that sounds reassuring but usually collapses the moment it touches real economic life. So when you hear the phrase, we do not need Canada, what I want you to ask yourself is not whether that sounds strong or patriotic, but what kind of economic system produces leaders who feel compelled to say it in the first place, and who actually pays the price when reality pushes back. On the surface, the story looks simple. American officials, commentators, and corporate voices insisted that the United States could stand on its own, that trade with Canada was optional, that supply chains could be rerouted, that energy, food, labor, and industrial inputs could be replaced domestically without much disruption. Many of you probably heard this framing in the context of trade disputes, tariffs, or broader nationalist rhetoric about bringing jobs home. It was presented as common sense, a big country, a big economy. Why rely on anyone else? But economics, especially under capitalism, does not work that way. It is not a story of independence. It is a story of deep interdependence built up over decades through corporate decisions, profit incentives, and political agreements that were never designed with ordinary working people in mind. And when those connections are suddenly treated as disposable, the consequences do not land on the people who made the speeches. They land on you, on your job, your prices at the store, your heating bill, and the stability of your community. What officially happened was not a single dramatic break, but a series of decisions and signals. Trade rules were questioned. Long standing agreements were treated as leverage rather than shared infrastructure. Industries that had quietly relied on cross border integration were told to adjust. Auto manufacturing, agriculture, lumber, energy, and transportation all felt the shift. For years, parts had crossed the US Canada border multiple times before becoming a finished product. Farmers had depended on predictable export markets. Utilities had depended on shared grids and pipelines. This was not theory, it was the daily machinery of production. If you have ever worked in a factory, driven a truck, stocked a warehouse, or depended on seasonal work, you already know this even if no one ever explained it to you in economic terms. Capitalism organizes production wherever it is cheapest, fastest, or most profitable. Borders do not matter to corporations unless governments force them to matter. And when governments suddenly do that, corporations protect themselves first. Workers do not get a seat at that table. The build-up to this moment did not come out of nowhere. For decades, both U.S. and Canadian economies were shaped around trade agreements that promised efficiency and growth. What they actually delivered was higher profits for large firms and chronic insecurity for workers on both sides of the border. Jobs were made dependent on foreign markets without building safety nets. Communities were told to be flexible. When things went well, executives collected bonuses. When things went badly, workers were told to tighten their belts. So when political leaders declared that America did not need Canada, they were leaning on a system that already treated working people as expendable. They assumed that disruptions could be absorbed. They assumed that markets would magically adjust. And they assumed, most importantly, that if there was pain, it would be someone else's problem. That assumption is the hidden engine of this story, and it is the reason what happened next matters far more than the slogan that started it. To understand how this actually worked, you have to look past the speeches and into the mechanics of the economy itself. When two economies like the United States and Canada are tightly linked, They are not just trading finished goods, they are sharing production. A piece of machinery might be designed in one place, assembled in another, and maintained by workers whose jobs depend on that entire chain staying intact. When you disrupt that chain even slightly, costs rise, delays multiply, and uncertainty spreads. And under capitalism, uncertainty is poison for anyone without power. Take something as ordinary as a car. For decades, auto manufacturing in North America functioned as an integrated system. Engines, transmissions, electronics, steel, and labor flowed back and forth across the border. This was not done to make life easier for workers. It was done because it maximized profit. Companies minimized inventory, squeezed suppliers, and demanded speed. When trade tensions increased and rules became unpredictable, companies did not suddenly invest in higher wages or new domestic capacity out of patriotism. They raised prices, slowed production, and looked for ways to shift the risk downward. If you were a worker in one of those plants, what did that mean for you? It meant overtime disappearing, temporary layoffs, or constant anxiety about whether your line would be next. If you were a consumer, it meant higher prices and fewer choices. If you were a small supplier, it meant contracts becoming fragile overnight. None of this showed up in the triumphant language of independence, but it showed up very clearly in people's lives. Energy is another place where the fantasy ran into reality. Canada has long been a major supplier of oil, gas, and electricity to the United States, especially to regions where geography makes alternatives expensive or slow to develop. You cannot simply flip a switch and replace that infrastructure. Pipelines, grids, and long term contracts exist because they are efficient within the logic of profit driven planning. When cooperation is strained, energy markets react fast. Prices fluctuate. Utilities hedge their bets. And again, the people who feel it most are not the executives, but households trying to pay monthly bills. Agriculture tells a similar story. Farmers plan seasons in advance. They borrow money, buy equipment, and make planting decisions based on expected markets. When those markets are thrown into question, farmers are left exposed. Large agribusiness firms can absorb shocks or lobby for subsidies. Smaller producers cannot. If you are a family farmer or a farm worker, trade disruption is not an abstract debate. It is whether your crop sells, whether your hours are cut, whether your debt becomes unmanageable. What is crucial to see here is that none of these outcomes were accidents. The system worked exactly as designed. Decisions were made at the top, framed as strength and independence, while the costs were distributed downward and outward. This is one of the core features of capitalism that I keep coming back to on this show. Profit is privatized, risk is socialized. When things go wrong, markets do not punish power, they punish vulnerability. And that brings us to responsibility. It is easy to blame one politician, one administration, or one bad idea. But the deeper responsibility lies in an economic system that encourages leaders to speak in nationalist slogans while remaining fully dependent on globalized profit networks. Corporations lobbied for decades to create this interdependence. They shaped the rules. Then, when those rules became politically inconvenient, they positioned themselves to survive the fallout. Workers were never asked whether this was a good idea. They were simply told to adapt. So when you ask what happened next after America said it did not need Canada, the answer is not collapse or triumph. The answer is strain, friction, quiet damage spread across jobs, prices, and communities. And that quiet damage is far more revealing than any headline, because it shows you who the economy is really built to serve. Once you see that pattern, it becomes impossible to unsee it. Because what unfolded next was not just about trade numbers or diplomatic tone, it was about power asserting itself and then insulating itself from the consequences. Large corporations did not sit around waiting to see if patriotic declarations would pay the bills. They ran scenarios. They adjusted supply chains just enough to protect margins. They renegotiated contracts. They passed costs along. And if you are wondering who did not have the ability to do any of that, the answer is probably you and the people around you. This is where the role of the state matters, and where many people understandably get confused. Governments like to present themselves as referees, neutral managers of the economy, but in moments like this, you can see very clearly whose interests are prioritized. When trade tensions threatened profits, emergency measures, exemptions, and special carve-outs appeared with remarkable speed. When workers faced layoffs or reduced hours, the response was much slower and far more conditional. Assistance came with paperwork, stigma, and time limits. That is not a coincidence. It reflects who has organized power and who does not. You might be thinking, well, surely Canada had options too. Surely this was a two-sided conflict. And that is true in a limited sense. Canadian officials responded, negotiated, and signaled their own leverage. But here again, the structure of capitalism shaped the outcome. Canadian workers were not insulated either. Plants slowed, exports stalled. Communities dependent on U.S. markets felt the shock. National borders did not protect working people. They simply defined which government explained the pain to them. What this episode really exposes is the myth that economic nationalism protects ordinary people by default. Under capitalism, nationalism often functions as a cover. It allows leaders to talk about strength and sovereignty while leaving the underlying profit-driven machinery untouched. The same corporations that insisted on cross-border integration yesterday suddenly present themselves as national champions today. And tomorrow, if conditions change again, they will pivot once more. Their loyalty is not to a country, it is to accumulation. Think about how this affects democracy. If major economic decisions that shape your job, your prices, and your future are made in boardrooms and then framed as patriotic necessity, where exactly is your voice? You can vote, yes, but voting does not give you a say in how production is organized, where factories are located, or how risks are distributed. Those decisions remain firmly in private hands. This is why so many people feel disconnected and cynical. They sense that something is wrong, even if the language to describe it is not always clear. There is also a human dimension that gets erased when we talk in abstractions. Behind every disrupted supply chain is a worker adjusting schedules, a family delaying plans, a community worrying about tax revenue and school funding. These are not temporary inconveniences. Over time, they accumulate. Stress rises, debt deepens, trust erodes. And then we are told that this instability is simply the cost of doing business, or worse, that it is a necessary sacrifice for national strength. But strength for whom? That is the question I want you to keep asking as we move through this story, because when America said it did not need Canada, what it really revealed was not independence, but dependence of a very particular kind. Dependence on a system that prioritizes profit over stability, power over participation, and slogans over lived reality. And the next step is to ask what that means, not just for trade, but for how we imagine an economy that actually works for the people who keep it running. At this point in the story, I think it is important to pause and really interrogate what kind of learning actually took place, because this is where the deeper patterns of the system become unmistakable. Economic systems do learn, but they learn in ways that reinforce existing power. Corporations learned where the political limits were. They learned how far rhetoric could go before it began to threaten profits. They learned which supply chains were politically sensitive and which could be quietly adjusted without much public attention. Financial institutions learned how to hedge against nationalist volatility. Governments learned how to walk back bold claims without openly admitting failure. But what did working people learn that left them more secure, more empowered, or more in control the next time this happens? Very little, if anything. One of the most revealing shifts was rhetorical. As soon as the consequences became difficult to ignore, the language changed. Suddenly, no one had made a clear decision. Suddenly, the disruption was framed as complexity, as global uncertainty, as an unavoidable feature of the modern world. Responsibility dissolved into abstraction. This is a familiar maneuver under capitalism. When policies benefit those at the top, they are presented as deliberate and visionary. When those same policies create harm, the harm is treated as accidental, diffuse, and nobody's fault. The economy becomes a force of nature, something that happens to us rather than something shaped by human choices. This rhetorical move matters because it trains you, the viewer, to lower your expectations. If economic outcomes are treated like weather, then demanding accountability starts to feel unreasonable. You are told to be adaptable, to reskill, to relocate, to absorb shocks with personal resilience. Meanwhile, the structures that produce those shocks remain untouched. This is not neutral, it is ideological. It shifts the burden of adjustment onto individuals while protecting the legitimacy of the system itself. At the same time, this episode exposed just how limited state power actually is inside a profit driven economy. Governments like to present themselves as sovereign actors, capable of reshaping economic reality through will and policy. But when trade tensions began to threaten investment flows, stock prices, and corporate profitability, the boundaries became very clear. Push too hard, and capital slows down or moves elsewhere. Create too much uncertainty, and markets retaliate through prices, shortages, and volatility. The state can speak loudly, but it governs inside a framework where profitability sets the ultimate limits. For workers, this produces a deep contradiction that many of you feel every day, even if it is rarely articulated. You are told that flexibility is a virtue, that efficiency is necessary, that competitiveness is unavoidable. At the same time, you are expected to show loyalty to employers, patience with instability, and gratitude for any job that survives disruption. Flexibility flows upward as profit. Insecurity flows downward as lived experience. This is not a failure of character. It is a design feature of capitalism. What happened between the United States and Canada also forces us to rethink the meaning of cooperation. Cooperation itself was never the problem. The problem was how that cooperation was structured and who controlled it. Cross-border integration could have been organized around stability, shared planning, and worker protections. Instead, it was organized around cost-cutting, speed, and profit maximization. When that fragile structure was stressed, it snapped exactly where you would expect it to snap along class lines. And here is where I want to speak directly to you as someone living inside this system. When you hear slogans about independence or strength, ask yourself how those ideas translate into your daily life. Do they mean predictable hours, affordable energy, stable prices, and communities that can plan for the future? Or do they mean volatility dressed up as virtue? Because an economy that treats disruption as acceptable collateral damage is an economy that has already decided whose lives are negotiable. The slogan, "We do not need Canada," may have sounded decisive, even empowering to some, but what followed revealed something much more unsettling. It showed that even the wealthiest economies struggle to manage interdependence without reproducing the same inequalities over and over again. It showed that the choice is not really between cooperation and independence, but between systems designed for profit and systems designed for people. And once you see that distinction clearly, it becomes very hard to go back to the comforting simplicity of slogans. Once you really sit with what happened here, the story stops being about a trade spat or a rhetorical misstep and starts revealing something much more unsettling about the economic order you live inside. What followed was not reform, not accountability, not a reckoning with fragility. What followed was absorption. The system absorbed the shock by distributing it downward, sideways, and outward until no single moment felt dramatic enough to demand change. That is how capitalism survives its own failures, not by fixing them, but by making them feel normal. Prices rose and never quite came back down. Jobs returned selectively, often more precarious than before. Temporary disruptions quietly became permanent rearrangements. Communities were told the worst was over, even as their baseline standard of living ratcheted lower. And if you are wondering whether any of this was framed as a choice, it was not. It was framed as realism, as maturity, as the unavoidable cost of living in a complex global economy. In other words, you were trained to lower your expectations, that training matters, because an economy that constantly destabilizes people's lives also reshapes their behavior. When your future feels uncertain, you plan smaller, you take fewer risks, you accept arrangements that would have felt unacceptable a generation ago. You stay in jobs that exhaust you. You tolerate schedules that make family life harder. You delay medical care. You carry debt longer than you should. None of this shows up in GDP figures, but it shows up everywhere else. Anxious people are easier to manage than secure ones. And look carefully at where policy energy went after the disruption. Governments focused on calming markets, reassuring investors, and restoring confidence, which is another way of saying restoring profitability. That was treated as the urgent task. Protections for workers, long-term planning for supply chains, democratic input into production decisions, those were treated as optional, secondary, or unrealistic. The message was clear, even if it was never spoken aloud. Stability for capital is essential. Stability for people is negotiable. This is where the conversation usually becomes uncomfortable because it forces us to confront what was not done. This moment could have been used to rethink how interdependence works. It could have been used to strengthen labor standards across borders, to coordinate planning instead of competing through cost cutting, to give workers a real voice in industries that depend on their labor. None of that happened in a meaningful way. Why? Because those changes would have shifted power, not just policy, and power is the one thing this system is designed to protect. You may also have noticed how quickly public attention moved on. That is not accidental either. Capitalism does not require people to forget entirely. It only requires them to stay busy, distracted, and exhausted enough that memory does not turn into organization. Each disruption is treated as unique. Each recovery is framed as proof that the system works. Meanwhile, the cumulative effect is rising precarity and shrinking control over your own life. So when people ask whether the United States needs Canada, they are asking the wrong question. The real question is whether an economy built on private profit and public risk can ever deliver real security to the people who keep it functioning. Because what this episode showed yet again is that when political strategy and corporate strategy collide, it is not an accident who absorbs the impact. It is not bad luck. It is how the system is wired. And if that realization leaves you feeling uneasy, that is not a failure of optimism. That is clarity. Clarity about the fact that economic arrangements are choices, not inevitabilities. Clarity about who those choices currently serve, and clarity about how much changes only when people stop accepting instability as the price of participation. So let me step back one last time and ask you to look at the full picture, because this is where the story really matters. What happened when America said it did not need Canada was not an exception, and it was not a mistake that can be quietly corrected. It was a stress test, and the system failed that test in a very specific, very predictable way. It protected capital, preserved power, and redistributed the cost downward while insisting that no other outcome was possible. That is the defining pattern of the economy you are living in. When things go well, success is attributed to markets, innovation, and leadership. When things go badly, responsibility dissolves. Suddenly we are told that no one could have known, that forces were too complex, that global conditions made harm inevitable. But you should notice something. The same people who claim uncertainty when damage appears are remarkably confident when demanding flexibility, sacrifice, and patience from you. And that asymmetry is not accidental, it is structural. Capitalism concentrates decision making while dispersing consequences. A small number of actors shape trade policy, production chains, and investment strategies. A vastly larger number of people absorb the outcomes. When interdependence works, profits accumulate at the top. When it breaks down, instability spreads everywhere else. That is not a bug in the system. It is how the system maintains itself. This is why nationalism fits so comfortably inside capitalism, even when it contradicts economic reality. Nationalist language gives people a story that feels empowering while leaving the underlying power relations intact. It tells you the problem is outsiders, dependence, or weakness rather than the organization of ownership and control. It redirects anger away from those who make economic decisions and toward abstractions that cannot be held accountable. And if you are honest with yourself, you can probably feel the exhaustion that comes from this cycle. Each crisis is framed as unique. Each recovery is framed as proof of resilience. Yet your life feels more precarious, not less. Your work feels more demanding, not more secure. Your future feels more uncertain, not more planned. That is not coincidence. That is accumulation, not of wealth, but of stress. If this made you uncomfortable, that is not a problem. That is the point. Economic clarity is rarely comfortable, but it is necessary. And if you want to keep having these conversations, if you want to keep pulling apart the stories we are told about capitalism, class, and power, then stay with me here. Comment, argue, push back, stay engaged. Because understanding the system together is the first step toward refusing to let it keep working the same way.